taking castle if we want to, doing something good for our bishop because it's now developed piece, and at the same time preventing white's plan of seizing the center with e4. Black's idea may be also to double the white's pawns on the c-file. So all those things are being done with the bishop b4, but mainly we are keeping the pawns flexible. Now we are only going to discuss what happens in case of white plays a3, although this is not the only move. But this move really is asking, what's your plan after you lose this bishop pair by taking the knight on c3? Because obviously black cannot go back, cannot afford this to keep the bishop pair because white's going to just go with e4. So in this case, white just gets really much better game. Instead, we're going to take on c3 and really now show why this system works for black. This situation already is begging a question like what's going to be next for black to do. We cannot just go and develop randomly, and white has good control over the center, and we also don't have bishop pair anymore, and we also have a bad bishop on c8 at the moment. So we have plenty of things to fix or to emphasize in our coming moves. The first thing that I'd like to ask is what's the pawn formation that we'd like to create in the center of the board as black? What's the right one that's going to help our bishop from c8 to get better? And also a pawn structure that is going to prevent white from doing what they want to do. Now, what is that thing that white wants to do in this situation? They have a couple of things to fix. First one is definitely to develop the pieces. However, one permanent problem that they have is the fact that they have double pawns on the c-file. And what they would really like to is to get an opportunity to undouble these pawns. So question for us is, what can we do in the center not allowing them to undouble those pawns on the c-file? In other words, what is that pawn that we can advance to the 5th rank without allowing white to undouble the pawns? But along with that, we don't want to allow their bishops to be active. We don't want, in other words, to make the game more open. So what is the pawn push we can make without risking anything, without allowing white to fix what is wrong in their camp? I'm going to show you the pawn structure that we're going to be happy with. And that's this one. I removed the pieces from the board. I'm just showing the structure. Of course, pieces are going to be somewhere. But this is what we'd like to accomplish with the pawns. Why this is so good for black and why it doesn't really work well for white. What we did here is that we pushed the pawn to the from d7 to d6 in order to support pawn push from e6 to e5. In this case, whatever happens to the white's d4 pawn, it's going to be only worsening white's. For example, if it takes on e5 eventually, and we take with the d pawn as well, you'll spot that the pawns of white on the c-file are going to stay doubled and also become isolated. So it's making them worse. They're not going to have a neighbor pawn to help them, the d pawn. Now, if this pawn instead advances, getting here, it's going to actually free a square somewhere close to the center of the board for one of the black's pieces to get there freely and stay there because it's going to be an outpost for us. That's this square here. Just imagine a knight standing on b8, going to a6 and then to c5, or via d7 to c5. This is one of the structures that we are trying to get, but there is also another one, like this. We'll talk about pushing the pawn to c5 and why it is good for black to do that as well. There is also this structure here, in which case we can see that white already pushed the pawn to d5 and created the c5 square, well, made it available for one of our pieces as black. In this case, we also have pawn on b6, because since the b file is open, we may imagine their rook coming to b file and we'll probably push to b6 in that case. Notice one thing. In all of those structures, we have pawns in the dark squares in the center of the board. So let's go back and see why we're doing that. If we do these things that we just saw with the pawns, we would make this bishop stronger by placing the pawns on the dark squares. The question may be also why we would push in some of those cases not only d6 and e5 but also c5. We can actually just do c5 even here. Now, c5 is a really meaningful move according to Nimzo. And remember, this thing that we are looking at is called Nimzo-Indian. He said that if there is a weak pawn, and in this case, white has a weak pawn on c4, what we're supposed to be doing is, well, just emphasize it by attacking that pawn. With some pieces, of course. Not with a pawn, but pieces. But why the c5 then? Well, because he also adds this. He also says that in order to attack with a success that pawn weakness that they have, like c4 pawn, we also need to immobilize it, meaning put something in front of it so that the pawn cannot move. By doing c5, we are immobilizing the c4 pawn, and then we're going to start attacking it. Now, how we're going to be attacking that pawn is not really for this video because it's a more advanced level of understanding this opening system. But I'm just going to say that it's meaningful. It's really like that. If you like to attack something, you'd like to make sure that that thing is not going to run away. So there is a lot of sense in playing c5 as well. Now, in order to fully understand what's happening there, you also need to see a bad idea that black can go for. And that's a typical mistake, I'd say, that black makes in this type of positions. That's to push d5 instead. And why this pawn push is wrong? Well, first of all, what are we achieving with it? Except of getting space by pushing the pawn 2 squares ahead. The bishop on c8 is not going to be better. It's still hitting a pawn, our own pawn, still locked in. And if we're expecting the opponent to take, well, it's a wishful thing, but white is not forced to do that. Why would white allow us to get better bishop? Instead, white can just go with e3 eventually, and if we take here, they would just recapture the bishop, keeping our bishop bad on c8. But on the other side, undoubling white's pawns. So basically, we're helping them if we do that. So d5 is a move, such move that basically can only help the opponent. If they would eventually, like let's say, have problem with the c4 pawn, they can easily just undouble. They don't want to do that at the moment, but that's an option that we kind of provided for them. But the main thing is that you're noticing that pawns are standing on the light squares. That's the most harmful thing we can do to the bishop on c8. Especially if we push the other one, the one on c5 to c6, it would really complete the damage to our own position. This is something really useful for you to know because it just like shows you immediately that the purpose of playing this system, which removes our dark square bishop immediately almost from the board, is to easily just place the pawns on dark squares and make this bishop better. Now, upon this strategy, you can actually build your game and your plan from the start. It doesn't need to work only against the Nimzo-Indian. It can go as well against anti-Nimzo-Indian. Those are the systems that white can use instead of playing knight c3, avoiding the system that you use with bishop b4. For example, if white places the other knight out to f3, or plays g3 with intention of playing Catalan opening, so-called. Let's go with knight f3 and see what we can do in order to get into the similar situation, only with a little difference. This little difference is going to be that white's not going to have double pawns. But it doesn't matter, we can still go with bishop b4. And the point is to, again, remove the dark square bishops from the board. Let's say this way. And then just place the pawns again on the dark squares. Let's say d6, e5. Finally, it should look like this. So if white pushes the pawn to d5, just look at their pawns and the bishop. On the other side, our bishop is quite free. So this system is so simple, I would say, and practical, because whatever they do, you're actually going with the bishop out with at least one purpose, and that's to get rid of it and place your pawns on the dark squares so that the other bishop is going to have enough air to do well.